Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. Today we have a very special guest. He's somebody who's one of the most active international voices for the Tibetan cause. He's a philanthropist and of course he's also an actor. Joining me is Richard Gere. Mr. Gere, thank you for being on the Dialogues.
Hi, Sonia. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How would you describe yourself? I've taken so many different facets of your life. How would you describe yourself
I'm
today?
really terrible at that. Right now, I'm a dad, more than anything else.
That's the most difficult job.
No, I've just brought my 22-year-old son, my first son, to India for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And we went immediately to Dharamsala and had kind of an extraordinary visit there. But I'm a dad. That's really what I am now.
And because your involvement with the Tibetan cause, with Buddhism began now, I think almost more than 30 years ago in the 1970s. So what was it like for you bringing your son, his first meeting with His Holiness and his teachings? Did it take you back to the time when you first became involved in this?
Well, of course, I haven't aged.
Of course.
I know. I have so many friends from that time. It was 40 years ago. It was the first time I was in Dharamsala. And I was a highly romantic young man of 30-ish when I came there. And I suppose I was looking for a magical moment of enlightenment. And I found something better. I found a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I found a culture that I fell in love with, and I felt was important to me, but it's important to the world, important to the universe, what the Tibetans have been able to achieve in promoting this ideal of a bodhisattva and a sense of universal responsibility. And of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the spokesperson extraordinaire for this incredibly open and profound vision that we are not separate from each other.
You've just been in Dharamshala, as you said, for His Holiness's 87th birthday as well. So that's really a landmark occasion. And the Prime Minister as well called up to wish him and greet him on his birthday. And of course, there was immediately a reaction from China saying the Dalai Lama is a separatist. That's one of the politer words. They've often called him.
It's ridiculous.
They've often called him a devil as well.
Of course they do. And a wolf and a vampire and a demon. And it's insane.
And for India, we've always seen him as an extremely honored and special guest. How do you think that whole balance plays out with India, China, and of course the Dalai Lama being here as an honored guest and us, in a sense, hosting the Tibetan government in exile as well?
Well, let me go back a little bit to what you were saying. I think clearly China still is deeply insecure. And that's why they behave the way they behave. Their surveillance budget is bigger than anyone's military budget. You only do that when you're deeply insecure about what your people are thinking and what they're writing, what their pain is. The Dalai Lama has proven himself to be a completely truthful, honest, and authentic person. I remember one time, he stuck out his tongue and he said, "My tongue." He said, "This tongue has never lied." And I doubt if there's anyone here who could say that. I certainly couldn't, but I believe it from him. So here you have the most responsible person, certainly one of them, on the planet, who has no personal power. He has no money, he has no economy behind him, he has no guns, he has nothing. But still, the Communist Party in China gets crazy about him. A man who's only spoken about peace and nonviolence. and dialogue. Everything should be resolved through dialogue, human beings talking to each other. I remember he said, we were talking in the old days about the Soviet Union. And clearly there's the U.S. and the Soviet Union were in competitive and sometimes quite violent confrontation. And he said, you know, things can be much simpler, but it has to be human. I said, why don't we have a situation where the leaders of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, they go off with their families to an island for 2 weeks every year, and they cook for each other, and they wash dishes together, and they talk about their kids. And I think that's the beginning of how conflicts get resolved in a human way with real wisdom and compassion.
Yeah, I'd like to see then President Trump and President Putin do that. But
I don't know if I'd want to be on that island.
Exactly. No, but just because I watched your testimony you gave to the U.S. Senate and 2 years ago as head of the International Campaign for Tibet, and you made the point that successive U.S. administrations have been quite naive when it comes to assessing China's expansionist plans, China's moves to actually penetrate markets, not just in the U.S., but perhaps but across the world.
Sure.
Do you see that unfolding even more? I mean, we've seen it in India with clashes on our borders.
There's not an office that I've gone into in the U.S. Senate, the Congress, or State Department, anywhere, that the first thing they say is we have to do something about China. First thing. Everyone knows it's not Russia. Russia's not the biggest problem on this planet. It's China. I think there was a very naive period that started in the 1990s, and maybe even before that, certainly with Nixon and Kissinger going to China. But the thought was if you can raise a large middle class, an educated middle class in China, that naturally they're going to become a democracy and responsible and law-abiding and in international citizens. Well, it didn't happen. The Chinese Communist Party is too clever for that, and the resources they have are too vast for that. Now, if you do that naivete along with the economic promise that people could make billions and billions of dollars there, there's a certain hallucination that has taken over the world. That we can't cross the Chinese, we need them too badly. Well, we know now we don't need them too badly. What we need are good citizens. We need citizens of the world that we can trust, who understand the rule of law, who understand human rights.
I think at the time of COVID even more, when we saw the authoritarian clampdown on citizens' rights in China, we never knew the real information on how what happened with the COVID virus. So the implications for the world, I think, which are often ignored by other countries. Is it because of the economic power?
Naivete and greed, or basic ignorance and greed are a very toxic combination. And that has created this hallucination. Now, it's a completely authoritarian country, of course. And being one, they can be monolithic in this message that they put out over and over and over again. Democracies change. We have new presidents, we have new prime ministers. They have a law now that he's going to be lifetime emperor of China. So you're going to have this constant, for decades, the same mantra of foolishness. The mantra that they've had from the beginning that Tibet, since antiquity, has been part of China, is completely ridiculous. We just had hearings in the U.S. Congress about this. Experts from around the world, including China, came and said, of course, this is not true. China itself didn't really emerge until the present as a cohesive place, that the dynamics in Asia have shifted over thousands of years, from certainly the Mongolians, but even the Tibetans controlled most of Asia all the way to the Caspian Sea for hundreds of years. But it doesn't matter. This constant mantra of we are strong from the Chinese side. We have owned Asia forever. Tibetans have always been controlled by the Chinese. And they're doing this with the Uyghurs now. Interesting thing about the Uyghurs is that the policies that we see now, and clearly have been brought out in news reports, I'm sure you've done some here at NDTV, those were perfected in Tibet.
No, and I think the point you make about greed is really relevant at this point, because countries across the world ignore that to do business with China, and you face the impact of that as well, whether it's you being blacklisted in China, whether you can't make a movie with you because of what the China markets or the impact on China markets would be. You just didn't care about that even when you were very much...
No, I don't care. Okay. Well, first of all, I mean, it's more complicated than that, isn't it? China has been so effective that people self-edit now. Chinese don't have to say, don't hire Richard Gere, or don't do this, or don't do that. People, for fear, do their bidding without even being told anymore. But in my case, I don't really care, because I don't make the kind of movies that they show there anyhow. I don't do the big superhero movies, which is what they want to see there.
The Marvel movies, Richard Gere as Captain America.
I think I was asked to do one many years ago.
You should have.
And it was kind of the wise old man in the picture.
Oh, no.
And I really had no interest in being the wise old man in a Marvel movie.
No, but just because I just wanted to ask also what's happening right now in our region, because we've seen, of course, what happened in the clashes on India's borders with China.
Yeah.
And also because...
Well, that's going to continue. They're going to keep penetrating borders like they have in Bhutan. They're certainly doing in Nepal. All across your border from Arunachal to Ladakh. Mm-hmm. They're going to be messing with the borders. Places that they said, still, we don't have any treaties there. We haven't decided where the borders are. And we have lots of weapons. We have a lot of money. And it's...
And I think India also waking up to its outreach again to His Holiness, because India also often goes to hot and cold in terms of how much they look at what China calls as provocation. But India now taking a very different stand. But the impact in the neighborhood, you've seen what's happening in Sri Lanka because of China economic debt, the One Belt, One Road initiative. Do you think we've realized enough, or this region has realized enough what China's plans are for domination of here? Or looking
They're very clear. They've been clear for many decades. Mm-hmm. They have a 100-year plan that came out in the 1980s. They're about 50 years ahead of that plan already. They told the world what they were going to do. And they've been very, very clever about it. They're patient. They don't have to get involved in a war. They get involved in economies. What they did in Sri Lanka, what they're doing in the stand countries in Asia, what they're doing in Mongolia. I mean, they don't have to fire a gun. They just own the countries through the economies. They lend money. I mean, the horrible thing that happened in Sri Lanka, lending money there, that they had to give them the port. So now China owns the port in Sri Lanka. Well, they've done the same thing in Italy. They have a deal now to basically own a port in Italy. It's crazy.
Why do you think people aren't listening, or why do you think the world isn't standing up? Is in democracies often, you talked of the 100-year plan, it's a 5-year plan till the next re-election comes up. How do you think we can actually change or look at this? The Dalai Lama's voice is there, he stood as one man. But how can we actually look at this more concretely?
Well, the Dalai Lama is not looking for conflict. He's looking for everyone getting together. Mm-hmm. And he says this can be a one world where we are responsible with each other. But to do that, you have to embrace everyone as your brother and sister. Mm-hmm. And Western countries have not been great at that. We've exploited people all over the world since the beginning. And there will come a time when we will be exploited. And I hope it isn't the Chinese, because it's not going to be fun for anybody. But I think we have to look at history. I think we have to look at ourselves. We can't allow this kind of poverty that exists all over the world. Now, you're a developing country here, and you've developed a lot in 40 years since I first came here. Certainly, India has changed enormously. But you still have extraordinary poverty in this country. At the same time, you have multi-$100 billion people here. One would expect that this sense of responsibility and fair play would kick in. No matter what your religion is, it doesn't matter. We all, respond to basic goodness, all of us. And the basic goodness is we can help each other everywhere. When the planet rises to a certain level of genuine love and compassion and concern, most all the problems that we're talking about, and we talked about before the camera was on, they go away. They're irrelevant at that point, because we are genuinely in a loving relationship with each other, as people, as individuals, in families, in villages, in countries, in the whole planet. But, Gandhi spoke about this constantly. It starts small. These things start small, but they have to be genuine, and then they can become bigger.
One of the most ironic things, perhaps, is that the Communist Party of China says that they want to choose who the next Dalai Lama will be.
I know. I saw one of the foreign representatives, and it was so pathetic. And he was reacting to the Dalai Lama, who is an extraordinarily highly developed yogi. And part of his practice every day is to, in fact, go through the process of dying. And that's part of the tantric practice that he does. And it's an amazing thing how that transforms your mind. The Dalai Lama gets up at 3 o'clock every morning to essentially practice how he's going to die. And he says, I'm not going to be born in a Chinese-controlled area. This poor gentleman from the Communist Party says, it's not up to the Dalai Lama to decide where he's born. It's up to the Communist Party, which is an atheist organization.
Yes. So
it's laughable. It's laughable.
It's laughable.
It's
tragic.
pathetic.
Yes.
Pathetic.
Do you ever, and in fact I asked His Holiness this once, do you ever lose hope? Because do you think that you've worked with the Tibetan cause for 40 years, you've seen, besides His Holiness, the monks, the many Tibetans who've lived here, who've never seen their country, who've been born in India and have never seen their land, the second generation. Do you ever think what will happen to the Tibetan cause after His Holiness? How will this actually go on?
Well, everyone thinks about that. I mean, he's such a dominant force. And I think we all kind of look to the sidelines and say, who could ever follow? And of course, no one could ever follow that. I gave a speech up in Dharamsala a few days ago on the birthday of His Holiness, the 87th birthday. And I said, look, the Dalai Lama has been carrying all of us for 87 years. I think it's time for us to carry ourselves and maybe carry him as well. And I think we all have to step up. We can do this. The Tibetans are probably the most successful refugee community in the history of the world.
Yes.
And they've maintained themselves in the extraordinary experiment of being Tibetan. They took these teachings seriously about being universally responsible and creating people who are universally responsible. Their resources went into that. They didn't build factories. They built people.
And His Holiness, of course, made the Buddhist cause an international one. When he came first as a young man, when he came to India, he spoke at the UN, and he made it an international cause. But of course, Hollywood and actors like yourselves made it trendy or hip at one point. Do you think that when people describe Buddhism as a fad or as something which is seen as cool to do because Richard Gere is doing it, what would you say to people like that?
Oh, I don't know. I think people try things, experiment. I think this movement, the Tibetan movement, which to me is much larger than Tibet. It's larger than the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama wants it to be larger than Tibet. It's a universal moment of singing songs of peace and possibility and longing. And I think this Tibetan message, or the Tibetan story, it is one that informs our hearts to the extent that we can change and get bigger and more responsible and more compassionate and more generous with our resources and our money, more generous with our skills and our capacities, more generous in our institutions to include everyone. This can happen. And I know people are probably drawn to His Holiness because they feel it. You've seen His Holiness many times. You feel it, that this is genuine. I remember talking to someone, it was a book in a library over in Dharamsala, and it was a book, I think it was called The Good Heart. And the Dalai Lama had done a series of seminars in a Christian church outside of London. And he was asked to teach on Jesus Christ, on the words of Jesus Christ. And I was making a movie there then. I was able on that weekend to go and see these teachings, and I was backstage with His Holiness before he went on. And of course, it was a certain tension there because in Christianity there's a creator God, a creator deity that created the universe. And in Buddhism there's no creator. The mind itself is the creator. We create ourselves, and we can create our futures just as well. We're responsible. There's no one to complain to, other than ourselves. But His Holiness started teaching, and the words of Jesus Christ that I grew up with, it's like I never heard them before, because it was coming from someone who had it, who really authentically and genuinely and completely was it. When he said the word love, in the context of love your neighbor, it was like I'd never heard this before. So when one encounters a being such as this, and you have many extraordinary beings that have come out of Indian culture here, in all the religions of this area, but when you encounter someone genuine, and someone who has, because of their karmic imprints and what they've done in previous lives, of course, are world shakers. The Dalai Lama, who grew up in a farm in Amdo, in the middle of nowhere, is now probably the most revered person on the planet.
So why would an actor who in the 70s and when we went on to do movies, for our generation, of course, we grew up on a pretty woman, an officer and a gentleman. Why would an actor who had all that, who seemed to have everything Hollywood and the world could offer him, what were you looking for why would you become a Buddhist or follow those teachings? And how would you reconcile being called the sexiest man alive to being a simple Buddhist worshipper?
I wanted to know why I was miserable and everyone else was miserable. I wanted to know why people suffer. I wanted to know why things go so wrong. And as you know, it's the first noble truth. After the Buddha had, many lifetimes of evolutionary work on himself and became the Buddha, the universal being, he said quite clearly, I don't know how I could ever explain this to anyone. What has happened to me? When I am now a universal consciousness. And all the deities came to him, and yes, all the dakinis came to him, and they were pleading and weeping and said, please teach. And he worked very hard. How can I do it? Well, he came up with the Four Noble Truths, the first of which is the truth of suffering, is that we all live lives that are unfulfilled and painful. Various degrees of that. But there's a basic kind of frustration and sense of incompleteness that I think we all have. And then he said, well, there are causes for that. There's reasons why we feel that way. And then, there is a way. If you remove the causes, you don't have that suffering. And then there's a path you can actually follow to get there. But the reality is, we are all in various degrees of suffering. And that's what I was concerned about. My own, but also as I looked around me, everyone else is suffering.
And so as we talk today, we referred to the Ukraine war, but we've got a whole younger generation. You said you describe yourself as a dad. We've got a whole younger generation growing up, seeing some of the, as I said, there's school shootings in the U.S., conflicts in every country in the world where violence like that happens. How do you keep hope and compassion at the center? And what would you tell your son and many others like him on why there's reason for hope today with your Buddhist teachings?
Because ultimately we all lean towards love. All of us. We all lean towards goodness, even the bad guys. If you look below the surface of their badness, we're all leaning towards love. And that is connection. When we connect, we care, because we see ourselves in the other. The Chinese do this with the Tibetans, and they do it with the Uyghurs, and they do it with the Hong Kongers, and the Russians are doing it with the Ukrainians. They're supposed to be their brothers and sisters. They're demonizing them now. It's some crazy thing about Nazis. the bad guys are always finding a way to create the other, to demonize the other. Your problems are because of them. And you obviously have it here in India as well.
But the advantage perhaps of being Richard Gere, being known once as the sexiest man alive, etc., is that when you speak, you have a voice.
I'm still not. I'm not the sexiest man alive.
That was
known.
You're still the sexiest man alive. But when you speak, people listen, and you've voiced strong political opinions as well. What would you tell leaders like ex-President Trump, President Xi, President Putin? What would you say to them today, especially after having been with His Holiness for this time right now?
I don't know what you do with someone like Trump, because he's obviously such a damaged, emotionally and psychologically damaged person that he needs a lot of help. A lot of help.
You should take him to Dharamshala.
I don't think he would go. No, I just wonder.
On anyone right now.
No, it's pathetic. I mean, I have great pity for someone like that. Karmically, he's creating such a negative future for himself. Again, I think that how much money do you need? How much power do you need? Putin is clearly a multi-billionaire, and he's a neo-czar at the moment. You know, he's going to be the lifetime president, prime minister, however he manages it, of Russia, as long as he wants to be. But what's the legacy you want? The legacy is one of pain and suffering and violence and repression, or have you elevated your people from the real place in their hearts? Have you elevated them? Have you created more light instead of darkness? And the ones you mentioned, you know, their concerns are so tight around themselves, they can't really see very far, that their actions are causing such bad. Do you imagine? I mean, what this war in Ukraine, destroying a country, literally destroying to rubble. Women and children, you know, hospitals, schools, playgrounds. It's insane. And the Russian people don't even know about it. You know, they don't have an NDTV that is showing the truth to them and gives a counterpoint of view. You think the Chinese get the real story about Xinjiang, or about Tibet, or about Hong Kong, or Taiwan? Of course not. I was talking to one of my teachers just yesterday, actually, and he said, look, this is the way it works. When there's so much goodness happening, and a basic transcendence is really happening, a kind of real wisdom is starting to emerge. So universal wisdom is starting to come up, and the balance is going that direction. You actually magnetize in a lot of negative forces. So in some sense, this kind of the violence in the U.S. in schools, and mass shooters, what we see in Ukraine, the craziness of how the Communist Party is destroying people, their own people as well as the Tibetans and the Uyghurs and everyone else that they touch. It's an indication that the light is really emerging. And we're seeing these kind of universal conflicts that are going to be happening on larger levels. Some of them, I fear, quite mysterious. Mm-hmm. That simple people like me can't really see, but they're happening.
Mm-hmm. I think the larger message of hope is one we should end this interview on. But
I have a lot of hope.
Richard Gere, thank you for this wonderful conversation, and thank you for being on the NDTV Dialogue.
Yes, thank you. I quite enjoyed it. Thank you very much.